Hello and welcome to Just Your Normal Misfit. I'm your host, Ann Thomas, and today the conversation is with someone whose work is at the intersection of learning, childhood, relationships, emotions, and of course, family. Dr. Neena David is a clinical psychologist who has been working with students, adolescents, adults, and families for over 27 years. She looks beyond the diagnosis. She looks at the child, their history, their relationships, and the invisible threads that hold a family together and sometimes pull them apart. I wanted to have this conversation with Dr. Neena David because she brings a perspective that's very important for us to understand. We think that learning disabilities are a very, very clean box. And alongside these diagnoses, very often we have a lot of emotional turmoil, a lot of unexpected aspects that we need to understand both as parents, as colleagues, as friends, and as people. We need to understand the complexities that learning disabilities bring, which is messy and layered and often deeply misunderstood. As we navigate these challenges, Dr. David's experiences, having worked with students for all these years and having worked and helped families, can give us a perspective that is often very distant to us. So today, we're talking about the complexity behind invisible disabilities and the unspoken realities of neurodivergent people and their parents. If this is your reality, I hope this conversation helps you. Dr. David, thank you so much for coming on Just Your Normal Misfit. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Lovely to be here and great to have to connect with you after all these years. So thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm surprised I did not know this about you, that you did a PhD in ADHD so long ago. I want to understand that. How did that happen? Where did that journey begin?
So there's a story behind that. There's always interesting stories. So I think this was in the late 90s and really early 2000s. I was presenting a paper on ADHD in Washington. And this was like one of the bigger ones that had a whole gathering of researchers. And after I had done with my paper on ADHD, and I was looking specifically at ADHD in the school context, I had an American researcher who came up to me and said, "So, how far behind is India from where we are in the West?" And I didn't quite know how to respond to that question because it really threw me off. For starters, it was just, I think, incredibly rude from a research perspective to have to put that out there and condescending, to say the least. But it stayed with me. It stayed with me. And I think the questions it raised for me at that point was that if I had to answer her in any kind of scientific, valid manner, then I didn't actually have the research at that point in time to respond. And that was actually the genesis that kind of held all the questions together. And years down the line, when my PhD process came together, then that's how that journey began. And so I began to look at ADHD specifically in an Indian context because all of our reading around ADHD is so Western oriented, and the US specifically, we seem to get like all of our ADHD research from there, or what parents were turning to when they were looking for help and resources was that. So there was that big gap that I found when I was reading up and looking at ADHD. And I wanted to look at ADHD in school contexts, in specifically elementary classrooms, and how do teachers actually pick this up? And what are their views around it? So that's how that began. And so the study kind of looked at cultural differences that we were picking up, and more specifically, what did we need to do differently in our classrooms that would incorporate good ADHD practice for students. So that was kind of where that research went.
One root question and a lifetime with it. That's a
Yes,
fabulous,
yes.
interesting piece, and all the more important because the cultural context, and even today, when I sit to research and years later have gone in and looking for more information, I still get thrown back to probably UK based podcasts, UK based information, or US based learnings. The cultural nuances, right? Where gender based nuances, boys are not here, वो तो होता ही है. These kind of pieces are still very, very prominent. Are there some distinct pieces that you learnt basis your research that you could say that, yeah, this is very, very India specific or at least Asia specific?
Yes, definitely. I think the big difference that my research was looking to pick up or really focus on were the cultural differences. And that's the kind of context that sets how we identify any of these conditions. So I think the one big thing that came up was that ADHD in India is strongly related in the school and academic context, as opposed to what may come up in the West with more parents actually calling up maybe their pediatricians or checking in on what's happening with my kid. Here it was teachers and schools that were taking on proxy clinic settings for ADHD. And the ADHD as a condition would usually come up around middle school and high school, and that was when a lot of schools reported a peak in the number of incidences or the number of times that parents would come in and talk about the fact that their children were not paying attention, they were distracted, and so on. And the schools would then have to actually look back and say, but we brought this up earlier. And what they found was that when kids in India move into middle school and specifically high school, the academic demands and that the ever present threat of the board exams and the grades kind of takes over all of our thinking. And that begin to weigh in on parents' decisions of seeking help, that need to allow for my child to perform well. So, therefore, I need to get help and access. So, the delay between a teacher picking up on some of these concerns and the parent actually accessing that help was usually about 6 to 7 years. And that's what the research was kind of showing. So that was one interesting big thing that came up, that it was so rooted in academic concerns, not so much the behavior. If the grades were dipping, that became a reason for an immediate need to get the diagnosis sorted and done. The other thing that came up interestingly was around culturally how we view the role of teachers in India. And I think it just comes from such a long oral tradition of having the guru and the shishya as a concept. So the value laden manner in which a lot of these symptoms are seen kind of tied in with this culturally held sense of the guru. For example, something like respect is held as such an absolute in our classrooms, in our culture. And so if you have a child who is not like really listening into what the teacher is saying, then that is seen as disrespectful. And it's not then just seen as a behavior, it is seen as a value deficit. And therefore, there are judgments then that are made at that value level for the child, for the child's parents, because the understanding is that this is reflective of poor upbringing. This is the result of poor parenting. This is the result of too much of television and media. So, a lot of value based judgments on behaviors was something that I picked up very quickly in my research. And these were very strongly held. So, even with teachers who had some kind of exposure to ADHD, it would circle back to this. It would circle back to the culturally held views of how a child should respond to a teacher in a classroom. The fact that this is a disability, this is a condition, and the child is not there intentionally messing up your morning was not something that kind of clicked. So that was something else that interestingly came up. But what I found quite amazing was that the diagnostic criteria that we list out in our ICD and DSM classificatory systems, those criteria were also criteria that the teachers were using in their own fashion to be able to pick up kids who did have these difficulties. So there was a high correlation between if I was just giving them a questionnaire versus if I just asked them, okay, let me know who are the kids with difficulties in the classroom. And there would be like a high correlation. So they were really quite efficient in terms of being able to pick up some of these difficulties in the classroom or kids who are experiencing these challenges. So those were some of the things that came up.
I just want to keep listening to you because everything that you said has triggered something for me, which is one, the school versus the home piece, which is very
Mm,
interesting, where we are all right with behavior, but as long as the academics are fine to some extent. So there's also a contrast here, a contradiction to one aspect, because the second piece of what you said is the value-based judgment. And you will not
yes.
believe, I have this paper that I wrote just day before yesterday, which says what is disrespect and what is a good student, which
Mm,
was basis a discussion that I was having because this child apparently was disrespectful because they were looking away when you were speaking to them. They
yes,
were
yes.
speaking their mind. Neither of them are disrespectful, but for an Indian
Mm,
teacher, in the cultural nuance that
mm,
we have, in the cultural context that we have,
mm,
both of them are unimaginable.
mm,
Responding back, talking back to, looking me in the eye, or staring me down because I'm
mm,
trying to
mm.
understand something, which is all ADHD traits. And then you start masking because you know that this is not a good piece to do, and then you start masking. Sorry, gone into another
Yeah,
track altogether.
but that's so true. The number of times, we would have had teachers who come in saying, so and so is disrespectful, and they're just looking away when I'm giving them an instruction. But for them to understand that this is the child um, who has ADHD or maybe has just anxiety in that moment, and making eye contact can be the most anxiety provoking aspect of that whole interaction, is not considered. It is just seen as disrespect, and there ends that argument.
Communication shuts down immediately with
Yes, it
that
does.
one aspect. And then there is no saving that relationship. And then there is no saving that parent coming back. And I personally have sat in so many meetings with so many different teachers where I'm telling
Mm,
them, please do not take this personally because my son might say something. He does not mean to disrespect you. He's speaking his mind because he really doesn't have the filters. Probably that. And even when it's
yeah.
not about my child, it's about just the
Mm,
ADHD symptom. The child who was on KBC recently, there was so
yeah.
much furor.
Yes.
All I could
Yes.
see was this really anxious child who just is in that seat and just wants to, can we get it over with? Please, can we just get it over with? And here we had an entire nation talking about whether this child is rude or disrespectful. Again, the value judgment piece that we are so used to. But coming back to this piece, sorry, about the school versus home and behavior versus academics, doesn't that kind of sit against these 2 points? Because one, I don't like
Mm,
being disrespectful. And if I'm an ADHD, or I'm disrespectful in all the actions that I'm taking. So my behavior is a problem, and I'm being called as a parent that your child just doesn't listen to us or is looking at us in a certain way or talking badly or all the other
mm,
questions. But help is not being asked for at the same time. For me, this piece is really not sitting well together because we are saying all these problems are just complaints.
yes.
And then what happens when only when the marks dip and then we are like, okay, now we need to do something about it. Is that what we are
Mm,
saying? That all the bad behavior, supposed bad behavior, I'm willing to accept and work around with as long as my
mm.
marks don't dip. Is that the cultural piece?
I'm going to come to this with another angle, which is that mm, oftentimes when kids who are higher average or above average in terms of their cognitive levels of functioning and are doing reasonably well, they are also the ones who a teacher will not pick up very easily in terms of being able to identify that there could be something wrong. Because if the sense is you're getting your grades, then you just need to just be a little more consistent with what it is that you're doing. Because, hey, you did get an A on this. So, if you got an E on something, like 4 days down the line, that's just you not putting in effort, or you just giving me attitude in some way, right? So they will scale it back to the person of the child without the understanding that there could be a condition that helps us understand what is happening within the child. So oftentimes the academic competence becomes like a guiding, like a north star sometimes for teachers to say, okay, yes, this is something that we need to pick up, or no, we don't. So yes, the academics is problematic. The other point that came up in my research was that if there was behavior that impacted on the learning of the other, and we are collectivist as cultures, all of our Asian cultures are more collectivist. So if you were doing something internally, if there were internalizing conditions,
That's okay.
okay, but if it began to impact on the other, that also then became a point of reference, and then of calling in the parent and saying, this is not helping, what should we do? But I also, picking up what you're saying, that oftentimes it comes in the manner of complaining about something, that sense that this is a behavior. And if a child is exhibiting this in the classroom or at home, is there a reason why this is showing up? And what can we do different around that? I don't find those conversations happening very easily. And yeah, I wish, that would change a little bit. But we come to it from a very top down, judgmental kind of place of just saying this is wrong. We are not okay with it. But how do we do different? Or even the recognition of, is there something that we could do? If I maybe seated the classroom differently, if I allowed the child to do this, this, and this, would I see fewer associated challenges in the classroom? That's few and far between, that we would have teachers who would actually engage in a joint solution focused kind of approach with the parent to try and figure something.
Absolutely. I really wish, because in all the conversations that we have, we often talk about the problem and we often expect a lot of the solutions coming from the parents. It is almost as you said, it's bad parenting, and hence
Mm,
there is something you need to do that can be fixed. And this whole idea that if a child could do well, they would really do well is often forgotten in the classroom. And the answer soul searching piece where a parent and a teacher come together, sit with the child
mm,
and say, what is causing this, or is there something that we can do differently, is so often missing. And I think which is also the reason that you have so many children in India with ADHD
mm.
but not a single IEP. I understand that there are many schools, and you have worked in one of the leading ones as well, and are
Mm,
part of so many other institutions. You would
mm.
recognize, where is the state of IEP today? Do we have them working on, when we talk about learning disabilities? Are these solutions that we are looking at all?
I wish there was a lot more fidelity in terms of how we work around IEPs in schools. That is not the grassroots truth, though it isn't. And I think somewhere in the busyness of having to deliver the curriculum and the numbers of children that we're seeing in our classroom, the IEP is something that gets parked very conveniently on the site. So, unless you have a school or a system that is driven by the philosophy of responding to all children accessing the curriculum and not leaving any child behind, unless you have that school and unless you have a leadership team that, spearheads that, oftentimes it ends up just becoming like a tick in the box. You will have this on school websites saying that we do have this, so on, but it is then just lip service. There are very few schools who would actually put thought to this and action out what it is that they're putting up. So the IEP is labor intensive. It requires a set of teachers who are trained in how best to work with kids. And in my experiences with a range of schools, it isn't always coming from the place of the teacher not wanting to help or not wanting to do something that would be useful for the child, but oftentimes just feeling constricted by the number of demands that are placed on them and therefore not being able to meet those ratios. Ideally, if we were like 1:8, we would be doing very well, but that is impossible given our population. And India has the largest school going population on this planet. And we have fewer teachers coming into the profession and fewer good, experienced teachers who stay in and continue to exert a positive influence. So, yes, I think the IEPs would help. Whether they are the only way in which we can provide those support services to kids, I don't think so. If you're just looking at ADHD-friendly classrooms, that is a classroom that makes sense to all kids in the classroom.
Absolutely.
It isn't specific to a kid who is neurodivergent. It makes sense to every child in that classroom. So we're really just talking about effective, good instructional practices, really, in addition, of course, to IEPs.
No, absolutely. And probably IEP again is a very Western piece because you're talking numbers and you're talking about seeing immediate solutions to something that is not really a problem that can be solved. Because if I'm looking at neurodivergence, then it's, of course, not something that I want to cure or solve for. It's just a different way of learning. And probably IEP looks at things in a way of how do I solve this specific problem right now? Having said that, and having been looking at that cultural context and having been in classrooms, could you just suggest certain ADHD friendly strategies that could really work for teachers, even, even in a class of 40? I know despite the challenges of resources, etc. But if I just want to do something different today and I'm feeling high achieving and ambitious, what are the things that I could probably take into the class?
So, what we understand by ADHD friendly classrooms are classrooms that minimize chaos. Children with ADHD do not do well in chaotic environments. And so let's just begin with the chaos in the classrooms. If there is some way in which we are reducing chaos, there is predictability in the classroom. Kids with ADHD do really well. So if you have a class teacher who says, okay, all the books come in here every day in the morning, this time, and this is the corner of my desk that needs to get this, then that's organized classroom. So it's as simple as that. It's about being able to know your children in the classroom, knowing them by name. I think is such a powerful feeling of control that it allows for the teacher to know that I can go up to this kid and talk to them and by name. So knowing the kid, knowing the child by name is an ADHD friendly classroom again. Being able to recognize that classroom seating plays a big role. So when we say preferential seating, it doesn't mean that the child with ADHD needs to be bang up in the front there under the teacher's nose. That's not it. It could just very well be that you're placing them in an area where there's less traffic and kids moving to sharpen their pencils or get their bags. They are not in the corridor of all of this movement. So anything that kind of reduces a lot of that external visual and auditory stimulation and allows the teacher to access this child more frequently through the period, that allows for greater monitoring and supervision. That is an efficient ADHD friendly classroom. Being able to put out very clear instructions for children, where you have things that are put out in ways that children can understand through different modalities. So if I'm putting something up on the board, or there's a chart, or we all have like our smart boards out there now, and I'm saying something in an auditory way, and building in movement in my classes and not expecting for an entire 40-minute block to go by without children being allowed to move a little bit and exercise themselves a wee bit. So the expectations around movement, of sitting in, of attending, those are things that teachers have to check in with. So when we let them know that on an average, you're going to get kids who are listening for about the first 12, 13 minutes, and then there's a dip. So if you happen to then focus on the dip and decide to go into a whole spiel about why nobody is paying attention, then you've lost the class. You've lost the class. But being able to quickly turn that around, being able to have your finger on the pulse of the class, knowing that there are dips in these and offering those movement breaks. It really makes sense for kids to be able to do that. And it always, always helps for teachers to affirm what is positive in the classroom when there is behavior that is appropriate. So, for example, you're watching this kid who has picked up their books and has opened it and gotten started with where they need to be. Our teacher radar usually is not picking up on that. We kind of scan the environment and we're usually looking at, okay, so and so and so, they're good, they're getting started, that's fine. Let me move on to the ones who are scrambling under the desk or trying to move out or use the loo break or whatever. So that teacher radar to actually be able to pick up the kids who are attending and to affirm that, to even just be able to say, I like the way that you're sitting in here quietly and you've got your books together. And it makes such a difference to the entire class. And this is a simple thing. When teachers say, I like the way that you're sitting up and listening to me, you will have the entire class kind of straightening up and wanting to listen. And it didn't require the teacher to constantly have to shout or berate them in any way. And at the same time, she was able to put out the behavior that was required. So I think the specifics of some of those make sense to all teachers and it makes sense to all students in a classroom.
Question there, just a follow up. The tendency of certain children to do well will be far higher. So you will have a few kids always ready, always sitting well, their books are ready, etc. And you will have the others who are fumbling. And how do you balance that? How do you make sure that you ensure that the same names don't keep getting called out? How do you try and find? Because I do understand that we reduce the chaos. But to some extent, for any teacher, the first response to that is, but the ADHD kid is the one who's bringing chaos to me. How do I respond to that piece?
That's a great question. And because I think what you are actually entering into is a whole other zone, which is teachers as gatekeepers. And the teacher actually allows for how other children also perceive and respond to a child with ADHD. And oftentimes, if a teacher is putting out a lot of negative feedback out there for a particular student, then that is also what the peers around them are picking up. So, if in the course of the day, I'm always calling out one child's name and saying, hey, sit down, do this, don't do that, and it's constantly that, this is also the child who then gets picked on. This is also the child who is open to being bullied by the others. This is also the child who gets set up and becomes the fall guy. With teachers, I think how they cue children on, especially with ADHD, is to establish non-verbal cues with them. So one that does not necessarily involve calling out their name. And so sometimes we will tell teachers to work out a signal with the kid in class. And it could be a simple non-verbal thing like I'm coming to your desk and maybe I'm just tapping my finger twice. And that's going to be our little signal. And when I do that, it means, hey, I'm watching you and I need for you to focus. And it's just that. So oftentimes it's a non-verbal cue that is very efficient and at the same time very discreet in being able to cue the child back into getting started. I'm also of the firm belief that relationships that teachers develop with their kids is powerful in allowing for some positive change in behavior. Calling a kid out during a break or a lunch or sitting down with them and having like lunch together and saying, I find that in class you're struggling with some of these things. What could I do that would help you? focus a little bit better? Or is there something different that you want to do in class that would help you? Having those conversations one on one, it really establishes like this communication highway between teacher and child, and allows then for a child to be a lot more receptive in the classroom when the teacher gives out those instructions.
That sounds great because you're already developing a relationship, and the kid who's being called out already has a personal relationship because you have a secret signal. You have something that's just so private and between you and me, and I'm already in love with you for that. So then following through is so much easier. So let's just imagine that we have ADHD and a learning disability. So you
Yeah.
have a child who probably, as you said, has a very high cognitive understanding of things. However, is
Mm.
much slower to write something or put something onto paper, probably a dysgraphia or a dyslexia. And that
Mm.
combination, how does the teacher work with that? Or how does the student come through and help themselves or support themselves to function in a classroom?
I think I want to shift that back to what the teacher can do, not so much what the child is able to do for themselves in the classroom. And I think that's a little when they're a little older and you have a lot more self-regulatory processes kind of showing up. But for younger kids who present in classrooms, like say elementary and middle school, and you have a comorbid diagnosis, so you have a specific learning disability, you could have an ADHD, or you could have anxiety or depression, any of these. In fact, ADHD, it's 1/3 of kids with ADHD will also have an associated other comorbid condition that we're looking at, right? So it can get very, very overwhelming for the child in the classroom because you're dealing with multiple issues. So I can't begin to attend and focus. And then when I do, I can't make sense of what it is that I'm reading. So for if I have like a specific learning disability in reading or in written expression, even the times that I am able to attend, I'm not able to translate a lot of that attention into something that's meaningful academically. So it does require a lot more monitoring, a lot more supervision. It does require a special educator who is able to actually work with the kid on strategies that are just building on those skills of the learning disability itself. How best are we moving through those skills and shoring up on that? And with the ADHD, you're looking at classroom behavior and management. You're looking at the possibility of medication for this child if the ADHD was substantially high or causing like a lot of distress, or there's a significant level of impairment. Then medication is something that would also assist the child. There are behavior programs that come into place that allow for a child to then begin to use a greater sense of their agency with being able to regulate and learn the skills of regulating their behavior. So it requires a team really to put this together. It is doomed to fail if there was just one teacher just bravely plodding through this and hoping that it would make a difference. It isn't, because it is exhausting. It is exhausting. So to have that team that you can lean into and know that there are clear areas that you want to work with, and how are you responding to some of these challenges in the classroom. If the child does this, this, and this, then this is how we pivot. This is how we maybe change something up for this child. So that ability to plan prior to actually witnessing the behavior in the classroom is also what allows teachers to come into it with a greater sense of control and competence.
Let's say this needs to be explained to a parent who's
Mm.
just thinking, yeah, the child has a specific learning disability, which means that they don't read with as much ease, or they don't write with that much ease, or probably they don't understand math, whatever the piece that they are looking at. As you mentioned, that you're talking about the teachers picking it up much before the parents do. And when that happens, and when you communicate that,
Mm.
it's not just about one specific challenge. How do you explain the layers that come through with these diagnoses? How do you just take parents through that?
that is a particularly fraught area when you begin to communicate the possibility to a parent that I think your child may have a difficulty with this, and I want to explore and see what's really coming up. So I think it starts at that point where you're bringing up the concern and not necessarily the diagnosis first. Parents who have a high degree of ease of communication with the school have greater levels of trust in being able to attend to what the school is putting out for them. There are many schools where I will have teachers talk about the fact that they're so wary of putting this information out there for parents because if it would upset the parents in some way, then they would rather not. And with the result that you have a kid who goes undiagnosed simply because we're worried about how the parent would respond if we said something that was not so pleasant. So it is a fraught place. And I find that increasingly now, where schools are seen as service providing in some way, the expectation is that my child needs to be doing well and my child needs to be happy at all times. So if you're beginning to tell me something about my child that is not favorable, I'm in a place where I'm not really attending to that very carefully. Sometimes, as a parent, I could just be getting defensive about then asking, okay, so what are you doing? Why are we seeing this? So, oftentimes, I work with teachers to help them understand that if we're seeing a parent who is putting out those emotions first, it's coming from a place of fear. It's coming from a place of anxiety around what is coming up for my child. And that's a hard one. For us, it's like a paper pencil thing. You get a diagnosis done. But for the child and their family, this is a diagnosis that they have to work with. So I think coming to it with some degree of being sensitive to the fact that this is a diagnosis that you're communicating to the parent, and it does have implications for the child. Coming to that with some sensitivity allows then for you to be saying the right things. Now, once we're able to put out there for a parent that these are the concerns, we take them through what that diagnostic process is going to look like. And then comes the actual communication of that report to the parent. And I think it's good then that clinicians take their time to go over what that means because sometimes that report can feel very clinical. It's a whole lot of jargon and scores and graphs that you're seeing out there, and it just feels it is worrisome for any parent to have to pick up something like that for their kid. For a clinician to hold that time as sufficient, as enough to talk the parent through what this looks like right now and what are the implications? What does this mean as the child moves through different sections of the school? How is this likely to show up? And more importantly, what do you think you can begin to do now? I think letting them know that we're not really dealing with a disease. We're not dealing with an illness or some terminal diagnosis that I've given you right now. This is something that we work through together with. And the ways in which your child learns to cope then allows them to function really well. So being able to set that off against, yes, there are these challenges, and these are the ways in which we respond, then allows for the parent to take a little more balanced view around these things rather than spiral into their own sense of distress or high anxiety around this.
What about a parent who's also seeing these challenges very clearly at home, who's very attuned to what's happening? I understand that there are a lot of parents who this feels like a slap, right? What are you talking about? Because you're looking at the child as this perfect reflection of yourself who's going to take
Mm-hmm.
your name forward. And there's so much expectation around that child, and understand where you're coming from when you're looking at the child in that manner. But there's this
Yeah.
whole set of parents who are also seeing this
Mm.
journey because, as we've spoken about, there are meltdowns, there are this
Mm.
inability to handle the sensory overload, there are these, just anger and tantrums that come alongside because there's so much that I would like to do, but I'm not being able to do, and it's not making any sense to me right now. And the easiest
Mm.
way for a young child to respond is this anger or just breaking down again and again. And you see that piece. And the parent comes from a space of, I don't have the answers. Can you help me here?
Mm.
How do you respond to that parent? That's a very different scenario.
It is. Yeah. So for some parents, the diagnosis comes as a relief. It comes with knowing that it wasn't about their parenting or that they were making just a big deal of something. So sometimes it can come as a relief that, yes, there is something that is showing up, and therefore we need to be doing something. And it gives them sanction to then involve other family members or maybe talk about it or access help and so on. So I think with parents, that point where you recognize that something is not feeling right, and this is where we always ask parents to lean into that intuitive space. If something is not feeling right, it isn't. It isn't feeling right. And you're pretty good on that. So when you begin to pick that up, is to keep your foot on the accelerator. Oftentimes, we take our foot off with the hope that somehow this will settle down or let's just give it time. Even if some conditions did that, just the fact that we're attending to it allows for you to actually stay in the game. So, when you are picking up on something not sitting well with you, keep your foot on the accelerator. It means then that you need to do your homework. It means that you have to get your child access to resources and support. It means that you have to begin your journey with also being able to understand what is happening with my child in this moment, because you are not alone. You're not alone. And I think this is across groups and communities that we work with, that single message that needs to go out. Because for a parent coming into this, stepping into it, it can feel just incredibly lonely as a journey to begin with and so daunting. And for them to know that there are resources, there's such a wealth of information out there. And in terms of accessing resources like professionals who are involved with this, who will actually take them through parenting and what would be appropriate in terms of parenting strategies for a child with, say, a learning disability or with ADHD, because there are parenting practices that can be tweaked, that can be worked upon. I think more importantly, it allows for the parent to understand that they fuel a lot of this journeying and exploration. So, attending to their emotional and mental health needs is the core of everything else. And if, as a parent, you are struggling in some way emotionally, and it's never just a one off, it could be, and acceptance is never just that one time that you sit in a clinician's office and figure, yeah, okay, this makes sense. It is an ongoing journey, and each stage presents its challenges. So, for the parent to understand that emotionally where I am is something that I have to attend to, it is not a luxury, it is mandated. If you're working with a child who presents with a range of challenges and needs, attending to yourself is what begins your journey into then saying, all right, I can read this, I can go and meet somebody, then I can do this. It starts with that. But and just to let to let parents or teens working out there know that there is so much of information out there, and one has to be able to ask for it, and you will be able to access it. Most times it's our worry about, what am I going to open up, or I don't want to deal with this right now, or this is feeling too much, that prevents us from actually just diving in.
You said something very, very important, which is parenting itself is a very lonely journey. Because let's not even get into neurodivergence. If I was just to feed the baby at 3 a.m. and I'm
Yes,
sitting up for a year or two, there are very few people coming in and out of the home because the schedules and it is very, very lonely. And then you add
it
a
is.
diagnosis to the whole piece. And let's say you've been lucky enough to get an early diagnosis, but it doesn't
Mm.
feel lucky in the first place. It's not making too much sense right now. there are two parents probably, and there are siblings probably, all of them with different expectations, different understanding, different way of looking at that diagnosis.
Yeah.
The complexities that layer this piece, how do you deal with it? Because as you said, just that the graphs and the numbers, and oh, it's a difficulty in writing, what's the big deal? Oh, we can just practice reading a lot more today and I can solve dyslexia. And we all love to talk about these. Oh, this person was dyslexic, and look, this
Look at
beautiful.
Einstein.
Yeah, look at
Yes.
Einstein. And it's always those pieces, right? And then there is, what did I do wrong? What am I doing wrong? Why am I not being able to hit Einstein level? These pieces. That's the part that I would like you, because I understand that you work with so many families. It's
Yeah.
whole loneliness piece. How do you get your partner to match with you? Let's start with that.
When we're working with families, I think the perspective that I like to hold is a family systems perspective, which looks at the fact that each of us is connected to the other and all of us form the whole. So when something happens to one, it happens to the other. We're an entire system in progress. And when you're looking at families and how working with a child who presents as neurodivergent, or a parent who could also then be picked up with a diagnosis of being neurodivergent themselves, it is challenging because it envelops the family, and family becomes the context that sets the trajectory for development. And so, oftentimes, when we're working with a diagnosis for a child, that need to involve both parents, if both parents are present, or parent and their partner or whoever, but to include not just the mother who becomes the default sole caregiver for this child. So there is a need to involve other members of the family as well in this diagnostic process, and to allow for them to know that these are the ways in which it can present, or these are some of the challenges that so and so may experience. How do you feel around it? What's coming up for you? So sometimes being in those therapeutic spaces for families, I feel, is very healing, and it allows for communication to actually then create frameworks within which you're going to be able to do this. Because in our culture specifically, where patriarchy is alive and kicking, the mother is the default caregiver. Having a father walk with you shoulder to shoulder in your child's journey, let's just say, is not a typical thing. I am seeing a shift, though. I would like to say I'm seeing a shift to give credit to some of those fathers out there who are doing this. But there is an unfair division of labor, and the roles and responsibilities is inevitably the mother's. So that's one thing, and what she is holding. You also have siblings who are experiencing this in their ways, and they begin to take on roles. You can have a parentified child who always feels that they need to step in and be the proxy parent, or you have the hero child who has to outshine everybody in order to compensate for the difficulties that maybe my parents are having with my sibling at home. Or you have the rebel child who then becomes the distraction. Now, everybody is focused on this. And so that takes away from having to always feel stressed about the child who is presenting as neurodivergent. So roles begin to solidify in homes very, very quickly around a child who presents with neurodivergent challenges. Being able to create ways in which parents and their children are being able to talk about such things, and there is that sense of connection and warmth, it makes a big difference then to everybody then pooling in and working through together. So, one interesting thing that I did find with families over the years is that it is a bit of a paradox in terms of how systems report working with neurodivergence in their family. So, on the one level, there's a high reporting of stress. As a unit, there's just stress. But on the other side, there is also this enormous sense of empathy, of strength, of resilience, and of personal growth that each family member has also had in their own experiencing of an individual with neurodivergent challenges or neurodiversity themselves. So there is that paradox. There is the stress. There is also the resilience and the growth at a personal level for individuals in the family.
Absolutely. And having been on that journey for a while, I would say there's so much that you learn and grow as a person. This conversation would not have happened if at some point I was not thrown into this journey thanks to my child. So there
Mm.
is so much possibility that happens because you go on through this journey, and there's so much empathy that you learn and you develop over time, and the sensitivities to see certain things that you would otherwise be blind to. So there are a lot of wonderful pieces about it. But having said that, and there is this conversation that is going around about this gentleman who's also a founder and has commented about how people need to have kids early, and who has also happened to separate from their partner because of an autism diagnosis. So clearly, neurodivergence is a piece even today which ends marriages. I really would like to take this opportunity to ask you for advice for a parent who's already struggling, who's already wondering what has happened or how this has happened or what should I do next, and is struggling with the relationship breaking apart. How does she cope? Or the parent, let's say the father at that point of time, how do you cope with letting go of certain relationships? How do you prioritize what is important at that given point of time? Do you have any thoughts around that?
I have been part of so many incredible women and their journeys through exactly what it is that you've mentioned, and this sense of suddenly finding themselves dealing with a young child. They've just been presented with a diagnosis, and they're dealing with a partner who's either emotionally checked out on them or who's then actually, going ahead with formal separation. And so the overall picture that presents when they come in is that of this grief that is so big and heavy, with the sense of feeling like I'm losing out and there is a death of a relationship. There is also the grief with the child and what it is that I had expected and what do I need to work with now. And the grief is not that I would love my child any less, but it is definitely a grief that sometimes is not validated, is held sometimes with a lot of guilt. So I think the big thing when women come in with those presentations is actually just attending to the grief and allowing them to talk about what it is that they're experiencing with that sadness, with that loss. And once there is validation on that, and once they begin to understand that there is no guilt in this. You're allowed to feel all of these feelings, and things are going to be hard for you. I think that becomes that first point. And from there, you begin to attend to, okay, what's coming up. And it's going in two directions parallelly. One, you're dealing with just the logistics of what does that mean to be a single parent. And the logistics covers a whole bunch of things, from where you are financially first. Is there a home? Do we have a roof over our heads? Are the children in school? Who's paying the fees? What are the resources that we're accessing? Who supports that? Who's paying for that? The childcare, etc. So there's a whole bunch of this, just the logistics that we're attending to. And the other part, which is oftentimes not addressed by single moms, is emotionally, where am I? Because we're constantly shock absorbing. We're constantly having to deal with the fact that there is no knight in shining armor that's coming by. And this is my journey with my kid when I go home today. And the strength that almost all of these mothers kind of pull up from themselves, like really dredge up from their inner being, is just incredible. I've always been just so humbled with the kind of strength they display, but to recognize that when we're talking about strength, we also are looking at how are we nourishing what allows me to put out this strength? How am I supporting myself in this journey? Who is my tribe? So that sense of being able to find community and your people to help you with this is an absolute. You cannot do this alone. You cannot. Even if it feels like it's me up against the world, and can feel like that on quite a few days. But to just know that the ability to reach out and ask for help is also a sign of resilience. Being able to ask for help because it comes. And it comes when you know what it is that you're asking for. So being able to sit down and say, okay, when I get home, these are the things that I'm feeling challenged by. So how can I break this down? What could I do different? Or who could I tap into at this point in time that would help me a little bit in this? So constantly working on that parallel, which is the logistics and what is the emotional, the aftermath of what's happening, is something that I encourage single parents to be constantly with, but to not minimize where they are, because I think levels of fatigue, of burnout, of just not taking care of themselves is particularly high among women. In fact, my postgraduate research was with women and with children with intellectual disabilities. And without a doubt, research has continued to show that same finding that mothers have a higher reported rate of anxiety and depression when you're dealing with a child who does have challenges, whether they're emotional, physical, intellectual. The mums they bear a lot of that. So it's important, I think, for them to be able to understand that this is going to come at a challenge for them, and they need to be able to put some of these things into place because that's what's going to then allow for them to move with this.
No, absolutely. And having been through that journey, I completely understand the piece about building your tribe. And it is draining. It is, of course. And as you said, the logistics of it sometimes does not allow you to put aside a therapist fee that would take care of that 1 hour where I could take care of myself. Because here is a parent who's looking at a child, who's looking at separation, who's looking at roof, who's looking at financial challenges, all of that pieces. And every penny that you would and every minute that you might want, and the maternal instinct might say, let's put it on the child because we really need to fix it. And I think it becomes very important as a parent to ask yourself why you're doing the certain things that you're doing and what are the reasons behind it. Because sometimes we are modeling for the environment that you're in, which is constantly telling you that you're probably not a good enough parent. You're probably not a good enough woman because your marriage fell apart. Your husband would not have checked out emotionally.
If
You
you
had put your focus on him and provided him the needs that he had asked for. And there's a lot of things that you are carrying. And even with the family that you have, probably they may be very supportive, but there are certain nuances of how they are dealing with your child that may not be right for you at certain aspects. The kind of language that they might use for a child who is neurodivergent, or the kind of environment they are offering your child. Sometimes it is about checking in with yourself and saying, what is it that I want? Okay, what am I doing and what are the reasons for what I'm doing these things? And also, probably once you have those reasons where you're trying to say, okay, you don't have to pretend that you're a great parent. And if I have that money for myself and I go in for a therapy session because it's important, I take that, even if it seems like it's selfish. And even if it means that I'm going to leave my child alone with a nanny today, okay, and
yes,
go and have a drink with my friends, allow
yes,
yourself that. because it is very easy for the society to turn around and say, oh, you're leaving your child alone with a nanny, with no questions asked of the male partner. But the moment the woman goes out, takes 5 minutes for herself, really? And having been there, I do understand it is so difficult to just allow that guilt to be put aside. And even today, as I said, parenting constantly carries guilt. And it's very important for us to say that who are we parenting for, right? It's about the child and it's about you, and it's not about what the world thinks for you. I honestly find that very, very challenging having said that. Because even today, when my son, you hope, that because you have this fabulously intelligent human being who understands things, who will just turn around, and because you have made all these sacrifices for them, who will turn around and magically show up and be this fabulous Einstein to the world, and
Right.
right all your wrongs. Because
Mm.
that's a lot of things that we put on the child, right? There's that parent who wants their child to just come out magically and be this amazing person, because that will shut the world up, because then your parenting was right. You have done right by your child, you have done everything right, and the child will stand up as a reflection of that. I think that's
Right.
also one big worry that comes up from all the conversations that we've had. That can we stop looking at the child as this person who has to carry one more thing for you?
Or feeling like, that your child is this project that we have to tweak some parts and it's going to be shiny and different in
And then
some
we'll
way.
have a ribbon
Um,
tied, and then the
yes.
project is complete.
So I think the expectations that as a society we place on parents is very high. So, exactly like what you said, and that guilt, even though you understand it at a cognitive level, it's hard emotionally and it still bothers. So if you're stepping out of the home, I may know this cognitively, but
Yeah.
there's still that little twinge that happens, and you're thinking, why is this feeling so hard when it should just be actually the first thing that we need to attend to?
There is
Yeah.
also this interesting piece that often comes up, especially with Thomas and me, who's my partner, where a lot of our conversations or conflict come around our child. A big part of the conflict comes around our children. Either one child, and since we have two children, one neurodivergent and one neurotypical, I think, as of now, you never know, and how we treat certain things. When you mentioned very clearly, it's me against the world, and having
Mm,
spent so much time with my older child, there is
mm,
often this piece of me that comes about me and my son against the world, right? When we get into this relationships, it's very important where you say that
mm,
the family as a system is such a beautiful way of looking at that whole piece, because we have to recognize that there is a parent and there is that relationship and there is this child and there is the sibling dynamic and there are
yes.
these interconnections, and how do you balance all of that without
Mm,
one not becoming more important than the other? Do you
right.
have any advice around that about keeping the balance?
I don't know if balance is a thing that we can aspire to. On most days, I think it's just going to be this is a good enough day. So maybe even just the scaling down in terms of expectations around the fact that it has to look this way or things have to be in balance, because that's not typically how families function. We still don't have a norm on what a regular family looks like, because all families have their degrees of dysfunction.
Right.
So I think what we're really looking for is wherever we are in our families, do we allow for each of us to be seen and heard? And do we matter as a family? And are there things that allow for us to stay engaged with one another's lives? So it's not so much that the disagreements or the conflicts that one may have, that is usually not necessarily an indicator of dysfunction. It's when we're not talking, it's when there are these absolute cold silences that are happening, or we are just emotionally unavailable to one another as partners or as parent to child. That's problematic. So if there is conversation, if there are conflicts, That's just part of where we are as human beings in a family system. But more importantly, do we address those conflicts? Do we come back to that? Do we say, okay, how did you feel around this? What do we need to do different? How can I show up for you? How can I be present for this? Those are the questions that we come back to. So it's not just the rifts that we're looking at, but what is the repair that we put in every single day that allows for us to then hold as a unit.
And the piece on transition, that is very important, right? Because you both manage those rifts and everything is looking so beautiful and everything's stitched together because you've discussed these conflicts and you've solved it and and suddenly everything changes. The environment's already different again because something else has come in, probably teenage or probably a change in classroom or a good friend has moved away. These are constants. And these transitions, managing these transitions are hard as is. But when there's a neurodivergent kid in the play, it just feels so
Yes.
much bigger. Why is that, and how do you deal with that?
I think transitions are particularly difficult because you've left a place and you haven't yet landed in the other, and you're somewhere in between. As a system, it puts everything in that system under stress because there are suddenly new demands that are being made on that system. So even if it felt like I've addressed some of these and these are taken care of, and like you said, like a pet dies, or you're moving from middle school to high school, or a friend hasn't read your text and then your world is just melting down. There are all of these things that happen. And I think I still want to hold as what is stable in the presence of the fact that there are always going to be changes and things coming at you really rapidly, many curveballs. But if the system itself is fairly bonded and has engaging communication networks within them, they are able to withstand a lot of this. It's like where you have houses in seismic zones that are built lightweight and you have bamboo. So they, even if they did collapse, they're able to build back and it doesn't really hurt the people staying in it. It's the same thing with families. Are we able to bounce back? And that is the resilience that we refer to. So when we talk about creating basic pathways of resilience within families, that is what is an investment. That is the insurance against days that are rubbish, because there are many days that come by in that manner. So I think really allowing for that to happen, expecting that those will come your way. But do we have a system in place? Is the family feeling cohesive enough to be able to then withstand a lot of these?
And how I understand that as a piece for the family, right? And I
Yeah.
understand that as the larger picture. But when you have a teenager who
Mm,
world is ending because the text has not been read, as you suggested. How do
yes.
you make sure you're the calm? And how do you help them transition and make them feel that it's not the end of the world? What suggestion would you ask a parent to be able to do that for this matter?
I'm thinking whether it's a child who is neurodivergent or a neurotypical child, when you're dealing with an adolescent, I think just first rule of thumb is to know that you don't have to fix everything. You don't have to fix everything. And I think as parents, we're doing that way too frequently for this generation. We're kind of rushing in, we're doing the whole snow plowing, not wanting them to feel any level of challenge or difficulty, and to recognize that some part of this journey is your child's, especially when they are in those teenage years and you have a child who is, say, neurodivergent. And in this, it can sometimes feel like a bit of a double whammy there because developmentally, the child is coming into their space as an adolescent. They are establishing their own identities. They are less willing to accept any kind of help and support, and they are all a bit prickly. Recognizing that I have to allow for my child to experience some challenges and to hold some of that distress, that skill I feel is a skill that we struggle with sometimes as parents. This whole bit that we refer to as distress tolerance. When the only expectation is that I need my child to be happy at all times, and that is an unrealistic expectation. It's only when my child is in some level of distress do they figure out a skill, do they figure out another way of doing something, and only then is there some growth. So I think when you see the distress, to allow for that child to own that and to just be able to say, I'm here and I'm willing to be part of this and listen to what you have to put out for me. And we can work through this together if you need me to, and step back.
Absolutely. And I'm really with you in the piece where we're talking about wanting our children to be happy all the time and how that is unreasonable, and why we as parents are taking so much on our shoulder. And that's just too much on us. However, there are two pieces that come up when you say that. There is also
Mm,
this piece that culturally, where we talk about
mm,
scaffolding, right? We want our children to go through so much.
mm,
For example, if I have a child with dysgraphia, which I do, and we
mm,
expect him to write pages and pages, how much is too much? Where I
mm,
say, yes, you need to be able to write. Okay, but I
mm,
do understand that leads to exertion and exhaustion, and it really doesn't make too much sense, or does
mm,
it? Right? Because the old age tells me that let them go through it and we'll figure it. But do we really
mm,
need to put our children through so much? Because, life is going to be difficult at some point. So let's get difficult and ready them right now for difficulties
mm,
that are
mm,
going to come in 10 years. So that's why we have childhoods that are so burdened today in India, right? Because there's that piece that constantly eats me to some
mm.
extent. And how much do I scaffold and how much do I step away from? So it comes from that worry.
It is a juggling act, and I don't think there is a definitive way in which you address that, because as a parent, your bandwidth, or like let's say the scope of things that could possibly go wrong, is a whole lot wider. You're more clued in as a parent, and your child may not have that perspective immediately. And you're able to see maybe 15 steps down the line, which your child currently cognitively they may not be able to. So you are in fact shoring up for a future that could be a little wobbly if they didn't attend to what they needed to do right now. And I think, having said that, I'm going back to what you said, Anne, which was, as a parent and as a mom, I need to ask myself, what am I doing this for? Who am I doing this for? I think those are such brilliant questions to again then put back into the mix and ask yourself, what is feeling important in this moment? And what do we need to attend to? And why is this important? And what is going to be enough to be able to allow for that movement? So I think at all points in time, what we want to do is do enough so that you have maybe a window or a door that continues to open out for you and you're not feeling limited by choices that you're making right now. And if I can then attend to whatever is feeling basic and minimum in order to achieve that, then that's what I need to stay focused on. Because it's very easy, I think, sometimes as parents to get swept up by what we're hearing from the school about, okay, these are concerns, these are challenges, there's an exam coming up, what are we doing? Or you have, X amount of kids in the apartment or around you, or relatives who are just all headed out to Ivy League colleges and doing spectacularly well. So it's just so easy to get caught up in all of that, and to then just actually just hit pause and say, what's right for my kid? What's right for my kid? And what am I doing now that allows for them to hold some sense of self, as well as being able to put in whatever effort is required in this moment? So it is a challenge, but I think the intentionality that you bring to it is important, because at the end of the day, you are also the only person lobbying for your child. There is no other major group that is standing out there. Being able to be there and be on the side of the child in that ring, that's important. So I think sometimes just reassessing where we are in that chaos that surrounds us with achievement is helpful to then root us back into what's important.
The second part that I was talking about, which is my friend who's a parent of a child with autism, very clearly said that the child was getting aggressive because demands were made of the child. The same thing happens if I take my son's phone away, where then it is, you know, that a tantrum is coming, you know, that it's going to
Yes.
get aggressive. And there are lines that you draw. And then there is this whole aggressive, angry meltdown, emotional meltdown, may not be an angry meltdown, may not be aggressive, but there is going to be a consequence. How does a parent manage through that? And that seems like a big thing because there is you who's saying that I cannot let anybody hit me, and that's not acceptable. And there is that worry that I could hear very clearly. There is the second piece which says that what if I allow it? And probably, you know, there is that if this continues and it's going to be pushed on to other people, and you have failed as a parent on drawing those lines. And it's the same piece, right? How do you handle something which is aggressive, which is again child led, and that the child is doing it sometimes because they don't have tools for it, right?
Yes.
And how do
Yes.
you build those tools for it, and how do you hold yourself emotionally through that piece?
That is really challenging for a parent. And one, I think that even when they're talking about it, can consume them with so much of shame around the fact that this is happening in my home, because it's just such a breakdown in terms of what we understand as authority in the family. If you have a child turning aggressive with the parent, there is just a fundamental breakdown. I think it's good to recognize that it never just arrives. There is usually precedence to something as significant as a child getting that aggressive with a parent. Now, whether that aggression is coming from other psychiatric conditions at that point in time, for example, there is uncontrolled aggression or physical violence. It could just be part of a psychiatric or a comorbid condition at that point in time that the child is symptomatically putting out there. That could be one reason. It could also just be in terms of how things were communicated within the family around certain consequences and rewards. There is an issue of something having gone wrong. It's also the third one, which is issues with self regulation. And for a lot of kids who are neurodivergent, the ability to effectively self regulate is the challenge. That is the primary challenge. For example, for kids with ADHD, they will experience emotions at a very intense level. So for them, when you're taking away the phone, the intensity to which they experience that is like 200 times more than what it would be for a neurotypical child. So then the expression of anger and all of that comes with it can also come from that impulsive ADHD place. I think a clear understanding with a professional about where is this coming from, what's adding to the mix in this moment is a prerequisite before you begin to identify what do we then do different. Because if it's coming from a place of maybe comorbid condition, then is there a medication that is required for that? Is there another way of intervention that speaks to that? And if it is the behavior and the consequences and the parenting, then does a parenting practice need to be tweaked? Being able to get back to that drawing board and figure what's causing this is then your pathway for allowing you to know what you then need to work with.
Truly. For example, the fact that when my child's ADHD is spiraling, then my ADHD is also skyrocketing at some point of time.
Yes.
Over time, I have been able to train myself to recognize that this is a spiral. And if I don't take it personally, all the emotion that's coming here, just allow for things to calm down. right? Or probably do something to calm down, which is probably give them a hug or whatever
Mm,
tweak. It
mm,
comes from the
mm.
recognition that is my response to their piece, which of course came so late, right? That of as a woman, as someone which is at 40s, when you recognize that this is, the parent is also as neurodivergent and hence cannot support a child who's that neurodivergent because structure
Yeah.
is simply missing in your life, right? How do parents again recognize that
Mm,
piece that the apple is really falling very close to the tree and
mm,
just bring in that piece that, okay,
mm.
this is also coming from you, and how do you work with yourself and get the help that you require before putting it on the
Yeah,
child again?
it is hard. And I think every time when I'm working with a diagnosis for a family, inevitably I will have the mother or father in that moment say, "You're describing me,
Right.
and this is exactly who I was, and these are the things that I've struggled with in school. And look at me now. I've been able to, okay, work through some of these things, and I've been able to do a whole lot of these things." And I think I get them to hold on to that. When you're saying, "Look at me now," you're going to then look at what are all the things that have gone into your history that have allowed you to be in this place where you're feeling reasonably comfortable and successful with where you are, or struggling, as the case may be. But when you have a neurodivergent parent and a child, that can be quite a heady mix. And there is the good in that you are actually able to empathize with your child, and you just have such an intuitive way of knowing how their brains work and how they're likely to respond to certain things because you've been there. And at the same time, if you're driven into those places where you are feeling triggered, then it's hard to kind of regulate yourself and be able to then attend to your child who needs some of this. So I think what I want to focus on is the fact that there is hard work that is involved when you are responding from a place of your own neurodivergence. That intentional recognition that these are the ways in which I get triggered. And therefore, when I see these happening, I need to do different. I need to pivot and figure out other ways. And I think there are many hits and misses in your ability to actually get there, because it just is. And we're talking about women in their 40s. And by the time you think you've gotten a great handle on things, you're headed into perimenopause and menopause. And that does its own number on ADHD and women specifically. Question that one raises as a parent of, how am I doing? I think is a great question to keep asking of oneself, because it allows for you to know that this is always, always a work in progress.
All I'm hearing is, God help me right now. So we put ourselves and the child, and we always ourselves where we are and how are we doing and how are we responding. And once we are able to do that, I think we are able
Yeah,
to
yeah.
breathe better and respond better.
A partner or a spouse who is quick on the uptake around these situations, and who's there and available, then actually teaming up on this, or being able to say, "Hey, when you see this and this with how I'm responding to things, then I need you to just step in and kind of you know be the other person in the room, because it can feel like the oxygen has been depleted in my chamber." Yeah, so be the other person who can then just come in very organically and then do things. But those are like well executed dance moves that partners or parents kind of work through over time. Sometimes we do that just organically, and sometimes you have to talk your partner or your spouse through this and say, "These are my problem areas, and or these are triggers. So when this happens, be there."
Excellent. But are there some tools that you could suggest in terms of emotional regulation that people could use? Or is there a toolkit that I can pull from, or you have any suggestions on?
So, when we're looking at emotional regulation, I think I'm stepping into the neuropsychological understanding of self regulation as coming from an entire constellation of executive functions.
Yeah.
So, even how we understand ADHD is no longer as a difficulty with attention, but as a difficulty with self regulation. Recognizing that when we're talking about executive functions, and if you're dealing with younger children, these are skills that continue to develop well into their mid 20s. That's when we begin to see like a lot of the settling in and the neural networks kind of sharpening themselves. So in between, if you're seeing the peaks and valleys, and to understand that it is coming from a place where it is work under renovation and progress, and that you're likely to see these bumps. But what you want to, I think, always identify when we're talking about self regulation is where is this impacting me in this moment? When I talk about self regulation, which aspect of my life am I currently feeling challenged by or struggling with? And then begin to work from there. Because if we just look at the self regulation, is going to be huge, from how much I'm eating to whether I'm exercising at all. It's all of that under self regulation. So work at it in terms of where is it presenting as a challenge? And then what do I begin to do around that? Because it doesn't work the other way. So sometimes, often, if clients come into therapy and we give them a general conversation about self regulation, in the hope that something will get different, it doesn't, because we don't generalize. We don't generalize. We need for it to be anchored in a particular challenge, a daily problem, perhaps, that we're struggling with. And then it begins to make sense, and we develop the skill sets around that.
How do I know that this is not regulation, this is masking? And how do I be very careful of this overlap that might happen?
That's a fantastic question. And I'm thinking you would really have to tease that out with somebody who is very skilled, because with a person who is masking, there is a high need for the difficulty not to be seen, or for it not to be spoken of, or to be addressed in any way. So even if, as a therapist, I'm probably hinting at that, if that person is not yet ready in their personal journey with saying, okay, yeah, this is something that I struggle with, then I will draw a blank. I can just maybe put that seed there and say, okay, you want to think about this, and where is that coming from? And then back off and see if it hibernates and it wakes up at some point in time in the client's mind. But the thing with self regulation is that it's not going to feel, you're not going to be left with a feeling of distress at the end of it. With the masking, you're going to feel that it's going to come at the cost of something. The fact that if I'm experiencing clinical depression and I have to put on this, my world ready face, it's going to come at a cost. That level of distress that it generates will add up pretty quickly. So, being able to pick up on if something is feeling hard, distressing, I'm feeling challenged, it's feeling like a burnout, then clearly walking into masking zones, and it's not feeling like regulation. Regulation should begin to feel like that sense of agency that you have, control, of power, of strength,
And
which is not part of masking.
that is possible for people with ADHD as well.
It is, yes. The number of clients, adult clients that I have who have masked their ADHD for years on end. Somebody who has been meticulous in putting down everything on a single list and keeping to their timers and things that buzz at every 5 minutes to keep them attentive and planned, and not realizing that, okay, this was to deal with the fact that attention was an issue, but they've come across as these super organized individuals. So ADHD can do that.
Fabulous. I know there are parts in our conversation that have seemed very heavy, and God help us, but I do want to leave with the sense of hope, right? That there is possibility despite the challenges. And if there is something that you'd like to say to give that sense of, because we've all come across that journey, and there, despite all the things that we've listed, which is whether it's masking, whether it's doing this journey alone, whether it's finding the right resources or digging through resources to get to the right people, it's all been possible. And if there's a message that you have for everyone who's listening, what would that be?
I think that first thing would be that you're not alone. You're not alone in this. And I think that's something that I've understood over many years of working with clients, is that you can start off feeling incredibly by yourself, but to understand that there is help, there are resources, there are communities, and it makes sense to find that. I think what that journey means for a lot of parents, and I see this in families where there is probably like a neurodivergent child and a parent together, it also brings up some of the finest and the best qualities that define us as human. And I think that's the powerful transformation that also happens, our willingness to be able to grow in that process and know that there is despair and there is also this amazing grace and strength that comes through with families, and how they then reach out to other families and those connections that are formed. So, yeah, I see that. And that for me is always just heartwarming.
Truly. So you're not alone, and there's a tribe there waiting for you, and it's together that we build that tribe. I think this has been so interesting for me, which is why I think I've overshot, and I had so many questions that I could keep going on and on with. But really, that's a lot of clarity that you bring in, Dr. Neena, in terms of the relationships, in terms of looking at things as systems and not trying to go and solve things just by trying to remove the itch, but to understand where the itch is actually coming in from, and just to look at regulation itself as a much deeper context. I think that's a really a new way of looking at things. And thank you for bringing the cultural context. It really means a lot, because that's where I think makes a whole lot of difference. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much for having me. I'm hoping that all of this was going to be useful in some way. It's been very engaging conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There is no perfect script. There is a lot of curveballs that will come at you as a parent, as a family member, but you are not alone. And if you pay attention and reach out and ask for help, you will definitely find it. That's what I heard from Dr. Neena today, and I hope that you heard the same. Until next time, be kind to yourself and to the children in your world who are just trying to make sense of this. Thank you. Till next time. Bye bye.